The dog's teeth were an inch from the surgeon's throat. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Chief Petty Officer Liam Cross was bleeding out on the table 30 seconds from gone, and the only thing standing between him and the medical team trying to save his life was 94 pounds of military-trained fury named Rex. Every attempt to approach had failed. 2 medics were already injured. Colonel Hargrove had just ordered the dog put down. And in the back corner of that trauma bay, a woman in a gray maintenance uniform slowly set down her mop. She knew the command. She'd been waiting months to use it. If this story already has your heart pounding, hit that subscribe button. Right now, drop your city in the comments below so I can see just how far this story has traveled. And don't you dare move from that screen, because what happens next will stay with you for a long, long time. The trauma bay at Naval Medical Center Portsmouth had seen everything. Blast injuries, burns covering 90% of a man's body, sailors pulled from sinking ships with lungs full of seawater. The staff there, the nurses, the corpsmen, the surgeons, they had learned to move fast and feel later. That was the job. That was the only way to survive the job. But none of them, not one, had ever seen anything like this. Chief Petty Officer Liam Cross had been brought in by helicopter at 14:22 on a Thursday afternoon. The flight medic's report had been grim shrapnel wound to the left side, significant internal bleeding, blood pressure, dropping, possible punctured lung. He needed the OR within the hour or he wasn't going to make it. What the flight medic had failed to adequately communicate, because honestly, how do you communicate something like this, was that Cross had arrived with his military working dog. Rex, a Belgian Malinois, 5 years old, 104 confirmed operational deployments, 47 documented neutralizations in hostile territory. A dog so decorated that his service record, according to the people who knew about these things, was longer than most captains. Rex had been beside Cross when the IED detonated. Rex had dragged Cross 40 feet through burning brush to the extraction point. Rex had stayed pressed against Cross's side during the entire helicopter flight, and when the wheels touched down on the tarmac at Portsmouth, Rex had walked off that bird with his handler, and he had not left his side since. Not for the intake team, not for the triage nurses, not for anyone. Dr. Patricia Voss had been the attending physician on duty when Cross came through the doors. She was 53 years old, 26 years in military medicine, and she was by every measurable standard unflappable. Her colleagues called her the Wall, not because she was cold, but because nothing broke her focus. Nothing rattled her. She saw Rex the moment they wheeled Cross in, and something in her chest tightened in a way she wasn't used to. "Somebody get that animal secured," she said, keeping her voice level. 3 handlers moved in. Rex didn't growl. He didn't bark. He simply turned, planted his feet, and looked at them with eyes that communicated something far more dangerous than aggression. "Don't." The first handler, a young corpsman named Davids, reached for Rex's collar. Rex moved so fast that nobody in the room could fully account for what happened. 1 second, Davids was reaching forward. The next, he was on the floor, his hand pressed against his forearm, his face white with shock. Not a bite. Rex had shoulder-checked him with enough force to crack the man's radius. Davids didn't cry out. He just looked at his arm and then looked at the bum and said very quietly, "That animal is not normal. Somebody get him out of this room, doctor." Voss said, and now the calm was starting to fracture at the edges. Cross, barely conscious on the table, turned his head. "Rex," his voice was barely there. A whisper scraped through gravel. "Stay." And Rex did. He sat beside the table, pressed against it, his dark eyes moving constantly, scanning the room, cataloging every person, every movement, every potential threat. His breathing was even. His posture was controlled. But when the second handler tried to approach from the left, Rex was on his feet in half a second, placing himself directly between the man and the table, and this time he did growl. It was the kind of sound that doesn't come from the throat. It comes from somewhere deeper. A sound that bypasses conscious thought and speaks directly to the ancient part of the human brain that understands without needing to be told that this animal will not stop. The handler backed up. "What is the status of the K9 handler?" Dr. Voss demanded, not looking up from Cross. "That's the problem, ma'am," said Lieutenant Reeves, the charge nurse. "Cross is the K9 handler. There's no secondary handler on record. The dog's been partnered with him exclusively for 3 years. There's no backup, no alternate." Reeves hesitated. There was. Handler by the name of Blake, but she's listed as separated from service. 8 months ago. Can we reach her? Another pause. Longer this time. Ma'am, Reeves said carefully, according to her file, Nora Blake's last known location is unknown. Dr. Voss finally looked up. Unknown. Yes, ma'am. The woman who might be the only person on Earth who can calm this animal, her location is unknown. That's correct. For a long moment, the only sound in the room was Cross's labored breathing and the soft mechanical rhythm of the monitors. Then find me someone who can physically subdue the dog, Voss said, and her voice had gone very flat. Because Cross has maybe 20 minutes. Colonel James Hargrove arrived at 1441. He was not a man who tolerated situations that fell outside of established protocol. In this situation, a combat-decorated MWD, holding an entire trauma team at bay, while its handler died on the table, was so far outside of established protocol that it existed in a category he didn't have a name for. He stood in the doorway and then looked at Rex. Rex looked back at him. Options, Hargrove said, to no one in particular. We've tried verbal commands in English, German, and Dutch, said the K9 liaison officer, a captain named Strickland. Rex isn't responding to standard military working dog commands. We don't know what language Cross trained him in. His records indicate a non-standard advanced protocol, but the specifics are classified. Classified. Hargrove repeated the word like it had personally offended him. Yes, sir. The Ghost K9 program. Something shifted in Hargrove's expression. Just slightly. Just enough for Strickland to notice. Ghost K9 was disbanded, Hargrove said. Officially, yes, sir. What does officially mean in this context, Captain Sorrow? Strickland didn't answer right away. And in that pause, Hargrove heard something he hadn't expected to hear. The answer to his own question. Get me everything you have on the Ghost K9 program, he said quietly. Everything, right now. Sir, most of it is, I don't care what it is, go. At 1447, Hargrove made the call that he would later describe in private as the hardest decision of his 30-year career. We're going to have to put the dog down, he said. Dr. Voss didn't look up. Cross won't survive the psychological shock if he's conscious when it happens. Cross won't survive at all if we wait another 10 minutes. The room went very quiet. Hargrove looked at Rex. Rex looked at Hargrove. Get the veterinary team in here, Hargrove said. And somebody find me a sedative strong enough to drop a 100-pound animal in under 5 seconds, because I will not have that dog suffer. He didn't like this. He hated it with every part of himself that had ever loved a working dog, that had ever watched a K9 partner drag his handler out of a kill zone because the dog didn't know how to give up. He hated it. But Cross was running out of time and there were no more options on the table. Or so he thought. Nobody had paid attention to the maintenance worker. That was in retrospect the detail that would haunt everyone in that room for years afterward, because she had been there for 11 minutes. Standing near the supply cabinet on the east wall holding a mop she hadn't used once since the crisis began, watching. Just watching. Her name badge said N, Blake Facilities Management. She was maybe 5'6", brown hair pulled back, no visible distinguishing features. The kind of person your eyes slid over in a crowd without registering anything. She had the particular quality of stillness that some people develop, not the stillness of inaction, but of absolute deliberate control. She had been watching Rex, and Rex just once, about 4 minutes earlier, had turned his head in her direction. Not a full turn, not enough for anyone to notice, just a fractional shift, a flicker of recognition so brief and so subtle that if you hadn't been looking for it specifically and intentionally, you would have missed it entirely. She had been looking for it. She took one step forward. Lieutenant Reeves nearly walked into her. Ma'am, you need to clear this area. I need you to step back, she said. Her voice was quiet, completely quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't timid. It's the quiet of someone who has never needed to raise their voice because they've never needed to repeat themselves. Reeves blinked. Excuse me, ma'am. This is a restricted lieutenant. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't have to. In approximately 90 seconds, Colonel Hargrove is going to order that dog sedated and removed. Cross will hear it, and the psychological shock combined with his current blood pressure will likely stop his heart before the surgical team can intervene. I need you to step back. Now. Reeves stepped back. She wasn't sure why she did it. She would ask herself that question for months. Something in the woman's voice, not authority exactly, but something older than authority, something that lived underneath it, had simply moved her feet before her brain could argue. The maintenance worker walked to the center of the trauma bay. Rex's head came up immediately. His body stiffened. Every muscle in the dog loaded like a coiled spring as he tracked her approach. His eyes locked on her face with an intensity that made several members of the trauma team involuntarily take a step backward. She stopped 6 feet from the operating table. She looked at Rex. Rex looked at her. She said something. Later, when the people in that room tried to describe what happened, they struggled with the language. It wasn't a command exactly, or it was a command, but it wasn't spoken the way commands are usually spoken with the sharp edge of authority. It was spoken the way you speak to someone you know, someone you've missed. The word was in a language nobody present could identify, not German, not Dutch, not Czech or French, or any of the languages used in standard military working dog training. It was something else, softer at the edges, with a different rhythm, like something that had been built specifically for one dog and one relationship and no one else. Rex heard it. The growl died in his throat. Everyone in the room heard that. The absence of it was almost louder than the sound itself had been. Rex's head tilted. He made a sound, not a growl, not a bark, something smaller and rougher and entirely different, something that sounded to the people watching uncomfortably, like the sound a dog makes when its person comes home after a very long time away. "Easy," she said, in English this time. "Easy, Rex. I've got him, I've got him." Rex's posture changed. Not all at once, gradually, the way tension leaves a body when it finally believes that the danger has passed. His shoulders dropped. His ears, which had been pinned flat, rose slightly. He took one step back from the table, then another. He sat. He looked at the maintenance worker with an expression that no one in that room could put a human name to because it was too large for human naming, too layered, too particular. Then he looked at Cross on the table, then back at her, and he stayed. Dr. Voss didn't waste a second. "Move, now!" The trauma team surged forward. Hargrove didn't move. He stood perfectly still, looking at the woman in the maintenance uniform, who had turned back toward the supply cabinet and was retrieving her mop as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just walked into the center of an impossible situation and walked out of it in under 2 minutes. "Who are you?" Hargrove said. She didn't answer immediately. She finished straightening the mop handle, smoothed something on her name badge. "I work facilities," she said. "That's not what I asked." She turned to look at him then, and he saw something in her eyes that he recognized not from people he'd met in offices or conference rooms, but from people he'd served with in places that didn't make it into official reports. The specific flatness of someone who has made decisions that cannot be unmade. "No," she said. "I suppose it isn't." Rex had not moved from his spot. He was watching Cross's face now, his body low and still sentinel quiet. Hargrove looked from the dog to the woman and back again. "Blake," he said, not a question. She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. She just looked at him with those flat, knowing eyes, and somewhere behind them, something waited patient as a stone, inevitable, as weather for a question that nobody in this room was yet ready to ask. Hargrove's radio crackled. "Colonel," it was Strickland's voice, tight with something that wasn't quite fear, but was close enough to be its cousin. "Sir, I pulled the Ghost K9 files. You need to see this." "I'm on my way," Hargrove said. He looked at Blake one last time. "Don't go anywhere," he said. She smiled. It was a small smile, and it didn't reach those flat, knowing eyes, and it said, more clearly than any words could have, "Colonel, I've been here for 8 months. I'm not going anywhere. I've been waiting for you to finally look up and notice." Rex didn't move from the table. Not when the surgical team worked around him. Not when the monitors spiked and the room contracted into urgent focused silence. Not when Dr. Voss called for blood and more blood and the OR doors swung open and everything accelerated into the terrifying controlled chaos of a life being fought for and almost lost and fought for again. Rex sat beside Liam Cross and he watched. And in the corner of the trauma bay, a woman who was not a maintenance worker and had never been a maintenance worker held a mop she had never once used, and she watched too. Both of them waiting, both of them patient, both of them keeping a promise that neither of them had ever put into words. Because some promises don't need words. Some promises are older than language. And some loyalties, the real ones, the ones built in the dark, in the places where nobody's watching and nothing is guaranteed, those don't break. Not for shrapnel, not for blood loss, not for military protocol, not for anything. The surgery would take 4 hours and 11 minutes. Rex did not move for any of it, and Nora Blake did not leave that room. Orchestrated dialogue-driven narrative with rapid pacing, multiple climaxes, twists. Orchestrated dialogue-driven narrative with rapid pacing, multiple climaxes, twists. The surgery took 4 hours and 11 minutes, and for every single one of those minutes, Colonel James Hargrove sat in a chair outside the ORR with a manila folder in his hands and did not open it. Not because he was afraid of paperwork. Hargrove had spent 30 years swimming in classified documentation. He had read things that had cost him sleep and cost him friendships and cost him 2 marriages and one particular sense of innocence that he'd never been able to recover. Paperwork didn't scare him. This folder scared him. Captain Strickland had delivered it without a word, which was unusual for Strickland, who always had words. He'd set it on the table, looked at Hargrove with an expression somewhere between pity and warning, and walked away quickly, the way you walk away from something you don't want to be standing next to when it goes off. The tab on the folder read Ghost K9 Program Operational Archive Eyes Only. Below that in red ink someone had stamped Program Terminated 14 months ago. Below that in handwriting Hargrove didn't recognize, did it though? He opened the folder. The first page was a personnel file. The photograph was small and grainy, the way all military ID photos are flattening, institutional, designed to reduce a person to their most official dimensions. But even in that photograph, something came through, something in the set of the jaw, something in the eyes. He'd seen those eyes 40 minutes ago across a trauma bay above a mop she'd never intended to use. Petty Officer First Class Nora Blake, Navy SEAL, Special Operations K9 Integration Specialist, Ghost K9 Program Unit 7, cleared for operations classified above top secret, status administratively separated, date of separation. 8 months, 11 days ago. Hargrove turned the page, and then he stopped, because the second page was a mission brief for something called Operation Hollow Ridge. And the date on that mission brief was 14 months ago. And the names listed under personnel involved included people he knew, people who were still active duty, people who were at this precise moment occupying positions of significant authority in this building and in buildings connected to this one. He closed the folder. He sat with it in his lap for a long moment. Then he stood up, walked back to the trauma bay, and found Nora Blake exactly where he'd left her, standing near the supply cabinet, the mop leaning against the wall beside her, now her arms crossed loosely, watching through the OR window as the surgical team worked on Cross. "We need to talk," he said. "I know," she said. "Not here." "I know that too." He studied her profile. "How long have you been planning this?" She was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone searching for an answer, the quiet of someone deciding how much of the answer to give. "Since the day I took the maintenance job," she said finally. Hargrove did the math. 8 months. 8 months, 11 days. A pause, but he started planning before that. How long before? She turned to look at him then, and the fluorescent light caught her face fully, and Hargrove saw something he hadn't seen clearly before. She was tired. Not the tired of a long shift or a bad night, the tired that accumulates over years of carrying something heavy in silence. "Since the night of Hollow Ridge," she said. The name landed between them like something physical. Hargrove's jaw tightened. "That operation is classified." "Colonel," her voice stayed completely level, "I was that operation." She didn't tell him everything right then. She wasn't ready to, and more practically, the OR hallway was not a secure location, and they both knew it. But she told him enough. She told him in the clip-compressed way of someone who has rehearsed a speech so many times it has lost all its emotional texture and become pure information. Operation Hollow Ridge had been a joint special operations mission 14 months ago. The objective officially had been to extract a high-value intelligence asset from a location that Hargrove didn't need to know. The mission had gone wrong. 3 operators had died. The intelligence asset had not been extracted. And the official after-action report, the one that existed in official records, the one that people with the right clearances could read, described the mission's failure as the result of hostile engagement and equipment malfunction. Blake had been there. Blake knew what the official report didn't say. And Cross Hargrove asked, Liam was there too. He was the one who... She stopped, took a breath, started again. He was the one who made it out with the evidence. What evidence? She looked at him steadily. The kind that doesn't fit in a report. Hargrove felt something cold settle in the middle of his chest. Blake, I've been waiting for him to come home, she said simply. I couldn't contact him directly. They were watching him. They've been watching both of us since Hollow Ridge. When I heard he'd been deployed again, I needed to be somewhere close, somewhere I could intercept if something went wrong. Something went wrong, Hargrove said. Yes. Her voice didn't waver. Something went wrong. He looked at the folder in his hand, then at her, then at the OR window where Cross was still on the table, still surrounded by scrubs and instruments, and the organized desperation of people fighting to keep a man alive. Who knows you're here, he asked. Officially nobody. The maintenance staff thinks my name is Nancy Briggs from Roanoke. A ghost of something crossed her face, not quite a smile, but its structural cousin. Unofficially, I suspect someone figured it out about 6 weeks ago, which is why I stopped sleeping in my apartment. Hargrove stared at her. Where have you been sleeping? Facility storage, Building C. She said it the way you'd say the couch matter-of-fact, slightly rueful, entirely without self-pity. The janitor's closet on the 3rd floor has a surprisingly decent heating vent. Something moved through Hargrove's chest that he couldn't immediately classify. It wasn't pity. Blake would have rejected pity with her whole body, and he knew enough about people like her to know that. It was something closer to the particular ache of recognition, of seeing someone who has been doing an impossible thing alone for a very long time and doing it without complaint because complaining was never part of the operational plan. I need to know who figured it out, he said. 6 weeks ago. Who? His radio crackled. He held up one finger and turned away. Colonel. It was Strickland again, and this time the tightness in his voice had graduated from close to fear into something fully arrived. Sir, we have a situation. I'm currently in a situation, Captain. Sir, there are 2 men at the main entrance. Civilian clothes, but sir, they're asking for access to the trauma bay. They say they're here for a patient. What patient? A pause. Cross, sir. They're claiming to be from Naval Criminal Investigative Service. Hargrove's eyes went immediately to Blake. She had already moved. She was no longer standing by the supply cabinet. She was 2 steps closer to the OR doors. Her body positioned at an angle that if you didn't know what you were looking at, might have looked random. Hargrove knew exactly what he was looking at. She had repositioned for sight lines. She was watching the corridor in both directions simultaneously without appearing to watch anything at all. She had heard everything. Stall them, Hargrove said into the radio. Sir, stall them, Strickland. Tell them the patient is still in surgery. Tell them it's a sterile environment. Tell them whatever you need to tell them. You have got 10 minutes. He cut the transmission and looked at Blake. NCIS, he said. Those aren't NCIS, she said. She said it with a certainty so complete and so unadorned that it stopped him cold. How do you know that? Because NCIS doesn't travel in pairs to routine medical follow-ups on an active duty casualty. She was still watching the corridor. And because I know the 2 men who've been assigned to watch Liam since he redeployed, those are them. Assigned by who? She finally looked at him. That's what's in the folder, she said, isn't it? It wasn't a question. Hargrove looked down at the folder in his hand. He had read 3 pages. 3 pages out of approximately 40. And those 3 pages had already told him enough to understand why someone had handwritten "did it though" on the cover in red ink. Had already told him enough to make his 30-year career stomach turn over in a way it hadn't turned over since Fallujah. Yes, he said, that's what's in the folder. Blake nodded once. Slowly, the nod of someone receiving confirmation of something they already knew, but had not until this moment been able to prove to anyone but themselves. Then you understand why I've been sleeping in a janitor's closet, she said. Inside the OR, Dr. Voss called for a second unit of O negative and didn't look up. She had been a surgeon for 26 years, and she had learned in those 26 years to exist entirely inside the work during surgery, to reduce the world to the span between her gloved hands, to hear nothing except monitors, and the voices of her team to feel nothing except the particular focused presence that kept people alive. It was a form of meditation in its way, an absolute and necessary narrowing, but something kept pulling at the edge of her concentration. Rex. The dog had not moved. He'd been directed to the far corner of the OR, the compromise that had allowed the surgical team to work while he stayed present, and he had gone there without protest, and he had sat there without moving, his dark eyes fixed on Cross's face with an attention so total and so unblinking that it had started to affect the junior members of the team in ways that were, Voss privately admitted, entirely understandable. Lieutenant Reeves had whispered to her 40 minutes into the surgery, "Is it normal for a dog to look like that?" Like what? Like he's praying. Voss hadn't answered because she didn't have an answer that wouldn't have felt absurd out loud, and absurdity was not something she had time for. But she'd thought about it. Between cuts and sutures and the urgent arithmetic of keeping a body functional, she'd thought about it. She'd seen family members look at patients on operating tables with that expression. Spouses, parents, people for whom the distance between themselves and the person on the table was the largest distance they had ever been asked to endure. She'd never seen an animal look that way before. She'd never thought an animal could. BP stabilizing, said her resident Chen. 90/60 and climbing. Good. She didn't let herself feel the relief yet. Relief was for after. Keep him there. Rex's ears moved slightly. Chen noticed. Did the dog just Chen? Right. Sorry. The work continued. In the corridor, Hargrove was making calculations of a kind he hadn't made since he was much younger, and the stakes had been physical rather than institutional. Different kind of combat, same fundamental math. He had two men downstairs who were not NCIS presenting as NCIS. He had a woman beside him who was not a maintenance worker, presenting as a maintenance worker. He had a folder in his hand that described in the dry, bureaucratic language of classified documentation a series of events that could, if the contents became known, end careers and possibly end freedoms. He had a man on an operating table who, according to Blake, was carrying evidence that corroborated everything in that folder. And he had Rex, a dog who had held an entire trauma team at bay for 20 minutes. A dog who had, according to the personnel file Hargrove had just read, been trained not just in standard military working dog protocols, but in something the Ghost K9 program had called loyalty architecture, a methodology so advanced and so specific that the dog's responses were keyed not to generic authority signals, but to individual voices, individual relationships, the kind of trust that couldn't be commanded or transferred or overridden by rank or volume, the kind of trust you built over years in the dark in dangerous places when nobody was watching and nothing was guaranteed. The evidence Cross is carrying, Hargrove said. Where is it? On him? On him as in Liam Cross is the most paranoid man I've ever met, Blake said, and for the first time something genuinely warm moved through her voice, brief and quickly controlled, but real. He doesn't trust digital storage, doesn't trust external drives. He keeps everything here. She touched her own sternum. Encrypted, memorized in his head. That's not evidence, Blake, that's testimony. It's enough to start an investigation. It's enough to start an investigation if Cross survives, right? The words sat in the air between them. Blake looked at the OR window. He'll survive, she said. You don't know that. No. Something changed in her face. Something settled, quieted, went very still in the way of deep water that has no bottom you can see. But Rex does. Hargrove followed her gaze to the OR window. Rex was still in his corner, still watching Cross's face, still with that expression that Lieutenant Reeves had tried to name and failed. And in that moment, looking at a dog who had dragged his handler out of a burning field and stayed beside him through a helicopter flight and held an entire medical team at bay and had not moved, had not flinched, had not for one single second wavered in the absolute completeness of his presence, Hargrove believed her. He believed her in the way you believe things that can't be argued or proven or filed in a report. In the gut, in the place below, logic where the oldest and truest things live. All right, he said. He tucked the folder under his arm. Here's what's going to happen, and he said, those two men downstairs are going to get 10 minutes with Strickland and not 1 second more. You and I are going to find a room that isn't surveilled. Yes, I know which ones are don't look at me like that, and you are going to tell me everything. Everything, Blake. Not the version you have been rehearsing for 8 months. The real version. The version that lives underneath all the other versions. She studied him for a moment, reading him the way she'd been reading rooms and people and threat levels for a career. Why, she said, why do you want the real version? Because Hargrove said, and his voice had the weight of someone who has arrived at a decision that will complicate every subsequent day of their life. I read 3 pages of that folder, and I already know enough to understand that someone in this building is very motivated for Liam Cross to not make it off that table. Blake went completely still. And I've spent 30 years, Hargrove continued quietly, watching people with motivation and resources arrange outcomes in operating rooms. I will not watch it happen again. The monitor through the OR window spiked. Both of them turned. Chen's voice was sharp and immediate. Beep whip, dropping. We're losing him. Dr. Voss's voice cut through controlled and absolute. Clamp, now, now! Rex was on his feet before any human in the room had finished processing the sound of the alarm. He didn't move toward the table. He didn't try to interfere. He simply stood, every muscle in his body taut and ready and waiting, his eyes on Cross with an intensity that was beyond training, beyond protocol, beyond anything that had a clinical name. And beside Hargrove, Nora Blake's hand found the wall, not for balance, for something to hold on to, just for a moment, just long enough. Then she straightened, her hand dropped. Her face went quiet again. But Hargrove had seen it. In that single unguarded second, he had seen exactly who she was underneath everything she'd built to survive being who she was. And it was the most human thing he'd seen in a very long time. Come on, Liam, she said very quietly to no one in the room. Through the OR window, Dr. Voss worked. Rex stood watch, and the monitor climbed. Slowly, jaggedly, 1 beat at a time it climbed. Downstairs, 2 men in civilian clothes were becoming impatient with Captain Strickland's explanations. And somewhere in the hospital, in a room that Hargrove had not yet identified, someone was making a phone call. The voice on the other end of that call said only 4 words. Is he still alive? And after a pause just a half second too long, a pause that contained an entire calculation, the answer came back. For now, the monitor climbed, slowly, stubbornly, the way a man climbs when he has absolutely no intention of dying. Not today, not on this table, not before he's finished what he came back to finish. Dr. Voss didn't say anything for a long moment after the crisis passed. She just stood there with her hands still inside the cavity of Liam Cross's chest and breathed 1 breath-controlled private, and then she went back to work as if the world had not just tilted on its axis and righted itself. BP, holding at 94/68, Chen said, and his voice had the particular quality of a man who has just aged 5 years and 4 minutes. Keep calling it, Voss said. Yes, ma'am. Rex sat back down, just like that. 1 moment on his feet, every muscle loaded and waiting, and then the alarm receded and the monitor steadied, and Rex sat not the slow, uncertain sit of an animal that has been ordered into position, but the deliberate, self-directed sit of something that had made a decision based on information the humans in the room didn't have access to. Lieutenant Reeves watched him do it and felt the hair on her arms stand up. She didn't say anything about it to anyone. She filed it away in the part of her memory reserved for things she couldn't explain and didn't want to try. Hargrove found the room. It was a record storage annex on the 2nd floor, the kind of space that institutional architecture generates accidentally too small to be a proper office, too isolated to be useful for meetings consistently overlooked on maintenance schedules, and crucially not on the facility's camera grid because it had been built before the camera system was installed and no one had ever gotten around to adding coverage. He knew about it because he had used it once before 3 years ago for a conversation that had also not been suitable for official spaces. He didn't examine too closely what it meant that he was using it again. Blake followed him in without comment. She looked at the shelves, the stacked files, the single overhead light, and gave the space the same quick, efficient assessment. She gave everything not decorative attention, but operational inventory. 1 door, no windows, 1 exit. She sat on the edge of a shelf and crossed her arms. Start from the beginning, Hargrove said. Not the version in your head, the actual beginning. She was quiet for a moment, organizing, not hesitating. There was a difference, and he could read it. The Ghost K9 program started 11 years ago, she said. It was built on a premise that standard military working dog training was leaving capability on the table. The standard model trains a dog to respond to authority, rank, command, uniform. It works, but it has a ceiling. The Ghost program asked a different question. What question? What if you trained a bond to respond to a specific person? Not authority in general, one person, one voice, one relationship. She paused. What if instead of building a tool, you built a partnership? Hargrove said nothing. He let her continue. The results were the dogs were different. Not just better at the job, though they were different in kind. The bond that developed was something the program's psychologists couldn't fully quantify. The dogs weren't following commands. They were making choices, choosing to cooperate because the relationship had built something in them that went beyond training. Another pause, and this one had a different weight. Rex was the program's most successful subject, and Liam was his handler from day one. I was brought in 2 years into the program as a secondary handler. The theory was that each dog needed a primary and a backup, someone the dog knew and trusted at almost the same level as the primary, someone who could step in if the primary was incapacitated. Her jaw tightened slightly. Rex accepted me. It took 8 months, and it wasn't easy, and there were days I thought it wasn't going to work. But he accepted me. The command you used in the trauma bay, part of a non-standard protocol Liam and I developed together. Language the dog associates specifically with us, not military, commands, not English, not any language. A third party could research or replicate. It's not in any documentation. It exists only in Rex's memory and ours. Hargrove absorbed this. In Hollow Ridge, the temperature in the room changed, not physically, but something shifted in Blake. Something that had been held back with considerable force moved slightly closer to the surface, and even though her face stayed controlled, even though her voice when she spoke stayed level, Hargrove felt it the way you feel a change in pressure before a storm, before you can see it or name it, just the body knowing. Hollow Ridge was a joint extraction operation, she said. The objective was an intelligence asset, a source who had spent 4 years embedded in a network that was funneling classified military procurement data to outside parties, private contractors, people who were profiting from knowing in advance what the military was going to buy and when. She looked directly at Hargrove. People with connections inside Naval Command. The cold in Hargrove's chest that had arrived earlier settled deeper. The extraction failed, she continued. Officially, 3 operators died in what the after-action report called a hostile ambush. The asset was not recovered. She stopped, took a breath that was slower and more deliberate than her others. What the after-action report doesn't say is that the ambush wasn't hostile. It was coordinated. Someone on the inside knew the extraction timeline, knew the insertion point, knew the asset's cover. Someone burned the mission before it started. You're describing a mole, Hargrove said. I'm describing the reason 3 people are dead. The silence that followed was of the quality that only exists when truth has been spoken plainly and there is no comfortable response available. And Cross has the evidence, Hargrove said. Cross was the last person to speak with the asset before the ambush. The asset gave him a name. She held his gaze. One name, the person who burned Hollow Ridge. Hargrove's hand tightened on the folder. Is the name in here? No, because the asset died before she could put it in writing. And Cross never reported it through official channels because Blake's voice dropped to something quieter and more careful. Because the first person Cross would have reported it to was in his direct chain of command. And Liam is not a man who reports something to the person it might be about. Hargrove sat down. It was an involuntary movement. His legs just made the decision for him, and he ended up on a stool he hadn't noticed was behind him, and he sat there with the folder in his lap and the weight of what Blake had just said distributed across his entire body like something physical. How far up, he said. I don't know. I only know what Liam told me, and he only told me part of it because... She stopped. Because the last time I spoke to Liam Cross directly was 14 months ago. The night before Hollow Ridge. Something moved through her face. It was brief, and it was entirely honest, and it was the most unguarded thing she had shown in either of their parts of this conversation. He told me to stay back. He said it was safer if I wasn't on the extraction team. I thought he was being overprotective. I thought, she stopped again, started again differently. He knew something was wrong. He didn't have the full picture yet, but he felt it. He pulled me off the mission list the morning of the operation. He saved your life. Yes, her voice was quiet and flat and entirely without drama. He did. Hargrove looked at the folder, then at the ceiling, then at the folder again. The two men downstairs, he said. You said you knew them. Who sent them? I don't have a name. I have a pattern. Every time Liam has been stateside in the last 14 months, those men or men like them have appeared. They don't act directly, they watch. They report. They're not authorized for action in a military medical facility, which means whoever sent them is operating carefully, staying inside the line. A pause. For now, Hargrove repeated. Cross-waking up is the problem, Blake said. A dead man can't testify. A comatose man can't testify. A man in recovery with proper protection, surrounded by people who know what they're looking for. She let the implication complete itself. You want me to secure him? I want you to do what you were going to do anyway, she said, the moment you read those 3 pages. Hargrove looked at her steadily. You don't know what I was gonna Colonel. And now there was something in her voice that was almost not quite, but almost the ghost of humor. Dark and dry and genuine. You came back to that trauma bay with the folder in your hand and told me not to go anywhere. You've been in the military for 30 years, and you recognized something in those 3 pages that made you angry enough to act. I've been reading people in hostile environments for 12 years. She tilted her head slightly. I know what I was going to do anyway, looks like. Hargrove was quiet for a moment. Then despite everything, despite the cold in his chest and the weight of the folder and the 2 men downstairs and the name that existed in a critically injured man's memory, and nowhere else on earth, something moved through his face that might in better circumstances have been the beginning of a rueful smile. You're a very uncomfortable person to be in a room with, he said. I've been told that. He stood. I'm going to need Strickland. Can you trust him? Yes, he's the one who wrote "did it though" on the folder. Blake blinked, just once. It was the most surprised he'd seen her look. That was Strickland. He's been sitting on those files for 6 weeks, Hargrove said, waiting for a reason to move them, waiting for, I suspect, someone like you to give him a reason. He moved toward the door. Stay here. Don't open the door for anyone except me. And if it's not you, then don't open the door for anyone. He left. The door closed behind him. Blake sat in the silence of the records room for exactly 4 seconds. She counted out of habit, and then she took her phone from her pocket. Not the phone listed in Nancy Briggs' employee file. The other one. The one that had been off for 8 months and 11 days, powered down and sealed in a static bag and kept in the lining of her jacket for one specific contingency. She powered it on. It took 40 seconds to connect. She watched the screen and kept her breathing even, and thought about Liam Cross on a table upstairs and Rex sitting beside him, and the name that lived in Cross's memory like a splinter in the dark, small and invisible, and capable of causing extraordinary damage if someone finally got in there and found it. The phone connected. One message, sent 6 weeks ago from a number she recognized. They know you're there. Get out. She stared at the message for a long time. Then she typed back, 6 weeks too late, not yet. Strickland arrived at the records room 7 minutes after Hargrove left to find him. He was younger than Blake had expected, mid-30s. Sharp eyes behind regulation glasses, the kind of focused restlessness that characterized people who had too much information and not enough authorized outlet for it. He looked at Blake the way people look at things they've heard described many times but are encountering for the first time in 3 dimensions. You're Blake, he said. You wrote on the folder, she said. It seemed relevant. He looked at Hargrove. Sir, the 2 men downstairs are out of patience. They're asking for a supervisor. Let them ask. Sir, if they escalate, then they escalate and we escalate back. Hargrove's voice was calm and entirely final. What I need from you, Strickland, is two things. First, I need Cross moved to a private room with security I select personally, not facility security, mine. Understood. Second, I need you to find out who those two men reported to when they walked through our front door, not who they say they're from, who they actually called. Strickland nodded slowly. That'll take some doing, sir. You've had 6 weeks of some doing, Hargrove said. I think you're ready. Something in Strickland's posture straightened, not the formal straightening of a salute, something more personal than that. The straightening of a person who has been waiting to be asked to do the thing they have already been preparing to do. Yes, sir, he said. He left. Hargrove looked at Blake. The message on your phone. Who sent it? She glanced up. You saw that fast? I'm old, not slow. He waited. She considered. Then she turned the phone so he could see the screen. He read the message. His expression didn't change, which meant his expression changed completely in the way that only experienced people can change their expressions, going so neutral, so fast that the neutrality itself was the tell. Commander Alexis Ward, he said. It wasn't a question. Blake watched him. You know her. I know of her. He handed the phone back. She's been conducting an internal inquiry for the last 3 months. Quitting, very quietly. The kind of quietly that only happens when someone is very senior and very careful and very aware that the people they're looking at are watching back. She knows about Hollow Ridge. She knows something happened at Hollow Ridge that doesn't match the official record. She's been trying to find the thread. He paused. You're the thread. And Cross is the needle, Blake said. The words sat between them, exact and true and sharp as the thing they described. From upstairs, muffled through 2 floors and a corridor, the sound of monitors. Still steady, still climbing. Blake closed her eyes for half a second. When she opened them, the focus was back, clean and complete. When Cross wakes up, she said, he's going to be disoriented. He's going to ask for Rex first. Then he's going to ask for me. She looked at Hargrove directly. When that happens, I need to be the first person in the room. Before anyone else. Before anyone who might carry a question in from outside and not realize what they're carrying. Agreed. And Rex stays with him. The surgical staff won't. Rex stays with him, she said again, and her voice had the quality of the command she'd used in the trauma bay. Not volume, not anger, just the absolute and total absence of any alternative. Hargrove looked at her for a moment. Rex stays with him, he said. She nodded. Outside the room, somewhere in the building's lower levels, she could hear, or imagine she could hear, 2 men in civilian clothes running out of patience and time and the carefully maintained pretense of legitimacy. And somewhere above her, in a private room, she didn't yet know the number of Liam Cross was breathing. Shallow and irregular and fought for, but breathing. Carrying a name in his head. The most dangerous name in the building. Possibly the most dangerous name in the Navy. Breathing. How long before he's conscious, she asked. Voss said 6 to 8 hours post-surgery, Hargrove said. If everything holds. 6 to 8 hours. Blake had spent 8 months in a janitor's closet on the 3rd floor of a naval medical center, waiting for a moment she wasn't sure would come. She had slept on a cot next to a heating vent and eaten from a vending machine and kept a phone off for 8 months and 11 days, and she had not wavered, and she had not broken, and she had not for 1 single second considered leaving. 6 to 8 hours was nothing. All right, she said. She put the phone back in her jacket. She stood. Then we wait, she said. But they both knew and did not say, because some things are understood without saying that the waiting was already over. What was coming next wasn't waiting. What was coming next was everything the waiting had been for. Upstairs, Rex lifted his head. His ears moved toward the door of the recovery room, tracking something, some sound or shift in air or vibration below the threshold of human hearing. His eyes went to Cross's face. Cross's hand on the blanket beside him moved, just slightly, just the fingers, the involuntary movement of a nervous system beginning to reassemble itself from the inside out, beginning the long, painful journey back from the dark place where the body goes when it has come too close to stopping. Rex watched the hand. Then he placed his chin on the edge of the bed beside it, and he stayed there, patient as a stone, inevitable as weather. waiting for the moment when the fingers would reach for him the way they always had, the way they had in burning fields and helicopter bays and every dark place they had ever come through together, waiting for Liam Cross to come home. Cross's fingers found Rex's fur at 11:47 p.m. Not a grip, not yet, just contact. The faint searching pressure of a hand that wasn't fully conscious yet, but knew at some level below. Thought below, language below everything that makes a person, that what it was touching was safe. Rex didn't move. He absorbed the contact the way he absorbed everything completely, without flinching, with the full weight of his attention. Lieutenant Reeves was doing her overnight check when it happened. She saw the hand move, saw the fingers find the dog's head, and she stood very still in the doorway for a moment before she did anything else. Later, she would tell her husband about it, and she would struggle to explain why it had made her cry, and she would finally say it looked like someone finding their way home in the dark. By feel. Because they'd made the trip so many times they didn't need the light anymore. She went to find Blake. Blake was in the corridor outside Cross's room. She had been there for 3 hours. She hadn't sat down once. Hargrove had offered her coffee twice, and she'd declined twice, and he'd stopped offering, understanding, in the way of people who know how to read other people, that she didn't want coffee. She wanted her attention undivided and her hands empty, and coffee was something you held, and he understood that she needed her hands free. Strickland had come and gone twice with updates, each one delivered in the low, careful voice of a man moving through a minefield he'd mapped, but not yet cleared. The two men from downstairs had eventually left the building, which was the most unsettling development of all. Not their presence, but their absence. People who are told no and leave quietly are either accepting the answer or going to find a better question. Given everything Blake had told him, Hargrove was not inclined to assume acceptance. The second update from Strickland had been worse. One of the men, the taller one, the one who'd done the talking, had made a phone call from the parking lot before he left. Strickland had been watching from a second-floor window with the controlled, guilty focus of a man who has decided to cross a line and is trying to do it precisely without excess. He couldn't hear the call, but he'd seen the man's posture change midway through it. The particular change of posture that happens when someone receives not instructions, but permission. Permission for what? Hargrove had asked. Strickland had looked at him. That's what I'm trying to find out, sir. When Reeves came out of Cross's room and told Blake that his hand had moved, Blake was already moving before the sentence was finished. The room was dim and quiet, the monitors casting their steady green light, the sound of Cross's breathing slow and rough and real. Blake stopped just inside the door, and for one moment, just one, before she put the operational part of herself back in charge, she let herself look at him the way she hadn't allowed herself to look in 14 months. He looked smaller. People always looked smaller in hospital beds, stripped of their equipment and their bearing, in the particular way combat-trained bodies carry themselves through space. But Cross looked more than smaller. He looked worn through, like something that had been pressed against a grindstone for too long. He was alive, though. He was alive, and his hand was resting on Rex's head, and Rex's eyes were open and calm, and that was what mattered. That was the only thing that mattered right now. She crossed to the bed. She sat in the chair beside it. She put her hand over his. She said quietly. His eyelids moved, not open, not yet, but the flinch of consciousness beginning to surface. Liam, you're at Portsmouth. You are in the hospital. The surgery went well. She kept her voice level and low and even. The voice she used when she was bringing him back from somewhere, from a mission, debrief, from a nightmare, from the particular blank place he went sometimes after a hard deployment. The voice that meant, I'm here. You can come back now. Rex is here. He's been here the whole time. Cross's fingers tightened in Rex's fur. Rex made the sound again, the small, rough sound that wasn't a growl and wasn't a bark and didn't have a human name, but that everyone who heard it understood perfectly. Cross's eyes opened. They were unfocused for a moment, moving, landing on the ceiling, on the monitors, on the green light, and the strange angles of an unfamiliar room. Then they found Blake, and something happened in his face that was so private and so complete that Reeves, still in the doorway, looked away without being asked to. Hey, Blake said. Cross's voice, when it came, was barely there, scraped raw and slow. You're here. I'm here. How long, Sednum? 8 months. He stared at her, processing. The math of what that meant, taking its time to travel from his ears to his brain, to the part of his brain that understood implications. 8 months, he repeated. 11 days, she said. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were clearer, more present, the particular quality of awareness assembling itself behind them in real time. Rex, he's been beside you since they brought you in. He held the entire trauma team at bay for 20 minutes. A pause. You would have been proud. 20 minutes. The ghost of something crossed his face, not quite a smile, but the structural frame where one would eventually live when he had the energy for it. Good boy. Rex's tail moved once, just once, precise and dignified. Then Cross's expression changed. The warmth didn't leave exactly, it just got compressed under something harder and more urgent that rose from below it. His grip on Rex's fur tightened, and he turned his head toward Blake with a directness that belonged entirely to the man she knew, and not to someone recovering from surgery. Who's in the building, he said. It wasn't a question. Hargrove's outside. He's with us. How do you know? He read the folder. Cross processed this. What folder? Ghost K9 Operational Archive. Strickland pulled it. A pause. Strickland. Something moved through Cross's eyes, a rapid internal calculation. He's been sitting on that for 6 weeks since he figured out I was here. She kept her voice quiet. Liam, there were 2 men here earlier, civilian clothes. They left, but Taggart and Morse, Cross said immediately. Blake went still. You know them. They've been following me since Kandahar. His jaw tightened. The effort of staying focused was visible on his face, small and controlled, but visible the way a current is visible in clear water if you know what you were looking for. Nora, the name. I know. I know, but not yet, not right now. She leaned forward slightly. Right now, you need to stay calm and stay awake and trust me for 12 more hours. Can you do that? Who else knows I'm conscious? Reeves, she's good. Blake glanced at the doorway where Reeves was still tactfully not watching. And Hargrove in about 30 seconds. As if on cue, Hargrove appeared in the doorway. He took in Cross, the open eyes, the hand in Rex's fur, the controlled, rapid assessment expression of a man who had woken up in hostile territory enough times that waking up in a hospital bed barely registered as unusual, and he exhaled. Chief Petty Officer, he said. Colonel, Cross said. Good to see you conscious. Good to be conscious. His eyes moved from Hargrove to Blake and back again. Reading the room the way he always read rooms, comprehensively, quickly filing details. You two have been talking. For several hours, Hargrove said. She told you about Hollow Ridge. Enough of it. Cross's eyes settled on Hargrove with the particular weight of someone deciding in real time how much to trust. It was a calculation Blake had watched him make 100 times. It always looked the same, no visible deliberation, no tells, just a moment of absolute stillness, and then a decision. The name she doesn't have, Cross said. The name the asset gave me. Yes, Hargrove said. If I give it to you, if I give it to anyone in this building in an unofficial capacity, without documentation, without a witness who has legal standing, it's useless. His voice was rough but precise. They'll bury it. They've buried everything else. Commander Alexis Ward, Hargrove said. Cross went very still. She's been running an internal inquiry, Hargrove continued. 3 months. She's been building toward exactly this conversation. She needs the name Cross. She has the legal standing and the documentation trail, and she's been waiting for the one piece she couldn't build herself. Cross looked at Blake. Blake looked back at him steadily. Wardy's, Cross said, and it wasn't quite a question. She warned me 6 weeks ago, Blake said. She's been protecting the periphery without knowing the center. She needs the center. Cross was quiet for a long moment. His breathing was even and controlled, the practiced evenness of a man managing pain without advertising it. Rex hadn't moved. The monitor showed steady. Then Cross said, She's coming here. It wasn't a prediction. It was a statement of something already in motion. Hargrove's radio crackled. Strickland's voice stripped down to pure information. Sir, Commander Alexis Ward just badged into the main entrance. The room got very quiet. Then Cross said with the dry, exhausted precision of a man who has been several steps ahead of everyone for 14 months and is very tired of it. I called her 3 weeks ago from Kandahar, told her if I came back in a bag to move on the investigation without me, told her if I came back breathing to meet me here. Blake stared at him. You called her from Kandahar. Encrypted line. Liam, they were monitoring you. I know, that's why I used Taggart's phone. The ghost frame of the smile appeared again, brief and sharp. He left it in the break room at the FOB. 40 seconds. I was careful. Blake opened her mouth, closed it, looked at him with an expression that was equal parts exasperated and something she didn't have a clean name for. You could have told me, she said. I didn't know if I was coming back, he said simply. The simplicity of it landed like something physical. Hargrove cleared his throat. I'll go meet Ward at the entrance. Neither of them acknowledged him leaving. They were looking at each other across the 14 months, in the distance, in the janitor's closet on the 3rd floor, in the burning field in Kandahar, and everything they had been carrying separately that had the same shape and weight and origin. You've been here 8 months, Cross said. 11 days, she said again. Nora, don't. Her voice was quiet and precise. Don't do the thing where you try to tell me it wasn't necessary, or it was too dangerous, or I should have trusted you to handle it. He didn't. He just looked at her with those worn, clear eyes, and Rex sat between them like a piece of evidence for something that didn't need to be argued. 8 months, 11 days, he said, and I'd do it again. Rex's tail moved once. Commander Alexis Ward was 51 years old, 23 years in JAG, and she walked like someone who had learned very early that authority is not conferred by rank, but by the specific quality of certainty you carry in your body. Hargrove had known her by reputation for years. She was compact, contained, and had the eyes of someone who reads documents the way surgeons cut precisely without excess, looking for exactly what's wrong. She walked into Cross's room and looked at the bed and at Blake and at Rex, and she said, "You're alive." Apparently, Cross said, "Good. I need you to be alive for the next 12 hours. She looked at Blake. "You're Blake?" "Yes. I've been looking for you for 6 weeks." "I know, I got your message." Blake paused. "I wasn't ready to move yet." Ward looked at her for a moment with the evaluative attention of a woman who has spent decades assessing the reliability of sources and witnesses and the difference between someone who is hiding something and someone who is protecting something. She appeared to reach a conclusion. She turned back to Cross. "The name," she said. No preamble, no warm-up, just the center of the thing reached immediately. Cross glanced at Blake. Blake nodded. "Rear Admiral Dennis Coulter," Cross said. The room absorbed it. Hargrove's face didn't change, but a muscle in his jaw moved once with considerable force. Ward's expression didn't change either, but her right hand, which had been resting at her side, closed into a fist, opened and closed again, a single involuntary movement quickly controlled. "Say that again," she said. "Rear Admiral Dennis Coulter," Cross repeated. Same tone, same certainty. The asset identified him by name by the specific briefings he'd had access to, and by 2 payment transfers routed through shell contractors that she'd documented before she died. The documentation is gone, but the name isn't. He held Ward's eyes. "It's been in my head for 14 months. "You didn't report it," Ward said. "Not accusatory. Precise." "Coulter is in my direct chain of command," Cross said, "and the 3 people who died at Hollow Ridge reported through that same chain." Ward was quiet for a moment, the particular quiet of someone running internal calculations at high speed. "Coulter was in this building this morning," she said. The air changed. Blake turned to look at Ward with the focus so total and so sharp it was almost visible. When she said, 0700, unofficial visit, he told the duty officer he was checking on a patient from his former command. Ward looked at Cross. "Nobody connected it to you because you hadn't arrived yet. You came in at 14:22. "He was here before Cross arrived," Hargrove said slowly, "which means he knew Cross was coming in, which means someone at the FOB told him the casualty manifest before the helicopter landed." "Yes," Ward said. "And the 2 men in the parking lot. Taggart and Morse work private security for a contractor called Meridian Group. Meridian Group has received 11 procurement contracts in the last 4 years. Ward's voice was flat and exact. All 11 were awarded after Meridian submitted bids that were somehow precisely aligned with the military's internal budget parameters that are classified. The shape of it was fully visible now. All the pieces Cross had been carrying for 14 months and Blake had been waiting to witness, and Ward had been building toward. From the outside, they were all in the room at the same time, and the shape they made together was enormous and ugly and entirely devastatingly coherent. Hargrove sat down again. The second time today, his legs had made a decision without consulting him. Cross's monitor beeped. Everyone looked at it. "I'm fine," Cross said to the monitor, to the room, to no one. Rex pressed his chin more firmly against Cross's hand. "Coulter knows I'm here," Cross said. "He knew I was coming in before I arrived, which means he knows I'm conscious, or he will within the hour." He looked at Ward. "How long to get a formal protective order and a documented deposition?" "For a rear admiral," Ward exhaled. "Normally weeks, through proper channels with proper review." "We don't have weeks." "I know we don't have weeks. I have an emergency authorization from JAG Command that I requested 3 days ago when I decided I was done being careful." She met his eyes. "I can have a formal recorded deposition filed and protected within 2 hours. Once it's filed, touching you becomes touching the deposition, which becomes obstruction of a formal JAG inquiry, which puts it in a category where Coulter can't maneuver." 2 hours, Blake said. 2 hours. Cross looked at Blake. Blake looked at Cross. 14 months in a janitor's closet, in a burning field, in a helicopter, in a trauma bay, and 4 hours and 11 minutes of surgery, and Rex carrying the thread of them through every dark place, all of it compressed into 2 seconds of eye contact that communicated more than the preceding conversation. "Do it," Cross said. Ward was already opening her case, but Hargrove was looking at his radio. Something in his posture had changed, the slight, specific change of a man receiving information before the device in his hand has spoken. The radio crackled. "Colonel," Strickland's voice, and this time it had crossed the line from close to fear into something that had arrived. "Sir, we have a problem." Rear Admiral Coulter just badged into the building. Nobody moved. Then Blake said very quietly, in the tone she used when the operational part of herself had taken full and complete charge, "How long ago?" 3 minutes, Strickland said. He has 2 men with him. They're armed." Cross's hand tightened in Rex's fur. Rex lifted his head. His eyes went to the door. His body loaded the way it loaded in burning fields and hostile corridors, and every place where the threat was real and the need was absolute, not aggressive, not reactive, but ready. Entirely, perfectly, irreversibly ready. And Nora Blake stood up from the chair beside the bed, and the maintenance worker from facilities was entirely gone. And what stood in that room between Liam Cross and whatever was coming through that door was something that no one in that building, not Coulter, not Taggart and Morse, not anyone who had spent 14 months trying to ensure this moment never arrived, had fully accounted for. A Navy SEAL who had been waiting 8 months, 11 days, for exactly this. "Ward," she said, "start recording." Ward's hand was already moving. Cross looked at Blake. "Together," he said. "Together," she said. And Rex stood up. Ward's recorder was running. That was the first thing, the one thing that mattered more than anything else in the next 60 seconds, that the recorder was running, that the deposition had begun, that Cross's voice was already on record saying the name that had been living in his head for 14 months like a splinter of fire. Rear Admiral Dennis Coulter. Ward had asked the opening questions with the rapid, precise efficiency of someone who has run emergency depositions before in less comfortable circumstances than a hospital room, and Cross had answered with the same efficiency: name, rank, date, location, the formal architecture of legal testimony, built fast and clean, and load-bearing from the first sentence. He'd gotten through 2 minutes of testimony when Strickland's voice came through the radio again. "Colonel, he's on the 2nd floor, taking in the stair, not the elevator." Hargrove looked at Blake. Blake was already at the door, her body positioned at the frame's edge, her head angled to watch the corridor in both directions. She had moved without sound, without visible urgency, with the complete economy of motion that only exists in people for whom danger is not an emergency, but a condition. "How many?" she said, not looking back. 3 total. Coulter and 2, Strickland said. "The 2 are Taggart and Morse. Armed, sidearms concealed." "They won't draw them," Blake said. Not in a naval medical facility with cameras and staff in the corridors. They're not here to shoot anyone. She paused. They're here to interrupt. Interrupt what? Hargrove asked. She looked at the recorder in Ward's hand. That, she said. Cross kept talking. This was the thing about Liam Cross that Nora Blake had understood since the first week she'd known him. He had the particular kind of courage that doesn't look like courage from the outside because it's so quiet. It doesn't shake or shout or make itself visible. It just continues. Through surgery and blood loss and 14 months of being watched and followed and knowing a name that made him a target, he had simply continued, kept the name, kept the evidence in his head, kept moving. He kept talking, now his voice rough from the surgery and the tubes and the long hours of unconsciousness, but steady. Building the record piece by piece, the asset's name, the location of the meeting, the specific transfers she described, the correlation with the procurement contracts, the names of the 3 operators who had died at Hollow Ridge, spoken carefully and completely because they deserved to be on the record with their full names and ranks and the truth of what had happened to them. Ward didn't interrupt. She let him build it. Rex sat beside the bed. His eyes were on the door. He's in the corridor, Strickland said. Blake didn't move from the doorframe. How far? 30 seconds. She looked back at Cross. He met her eyes over Ward's shoulder and gave one small nod. I'm not stopping, and looked back at Ward and kept going. 20 seconds. 10. Hargrove stepped up beside Blake. I've got this, he said quietly. We both have it, she said. Blake, Colonel. She looked at him directly just for a second. With respect, you've been doing this alone for 30 years. You don't have to anymore. Hargrove was quiet for a moment, then he stepped into the corridor beside her. Rear Admiral Dennis Coulter was 62 years old, silver-haired and broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had been described in dozens of official Navy profiles as distinguished. He carried himself with the specific gravity of a man who had spent 40 years being the most important person in every room he entered and who had arranged very carefully for that to continue being true. He turned the corner and stopped. Blake was standing in the corridor, not aggressive, not threatening, just standing there, arms loose at her sides in the maintenance uniform she'd worn for 8 months, with those flat, knowing eyes and the particular stillness that had made Lieutenant Reeves step back without understanding why. Taggart was to Coulter's left. Morse was to his right. Hargrove was one step behind Blake. Coulter looked at Blake. The way you look at something you've been told has been neutralized when you discover it has not been neutralized. Petty Officer Blake, he said. His voice was entirely composed. Decades of composed. I wasn't aware you were still on the installation. I know you weren't, she said. This area is... Commander Ward is currently taking a formal deposition from Chief Petty Officer Cross, Blake said. Filed with JAG Command, recording running, chain of custody intact. She held his eyes. It started 4 minutes ago. Something happened in Coulter's face. It was small and it was fast, and he controlled it almost immediately, but Blake was watching for it, and she caught it the fraction of a second where 40 years of composure cracked along a hairline fault and showed what lived underneath. Not anger, not shock, calculation. Pure, rapid, cold calculation. I'm here to check on a patient, Coulter said. Cross is not currently receiving visitors, Hargrove said from behind Blake. His voice was the voice of a man who has made a decision and does not intend to revisit it. Medical directive, Dr. Voss's orders. I outrank. You outrank me, sir, Hargrove said. You don't outrank a surgical attending's post-operative patient directive. That's federal medical law, and I expect you know it. Taggart shifted his weight to his right foot. Blake's eyes went to him immediately. Taggart went very still. You used his phone, Blake said without looking away from Taggart. In Kandahar, 40 seconds. She said it the way you say something you've known for a while and are only now choosing to release. He told me. Taggart's jaw tightened. I don't know what... You left it on the break room table. He had 40 seconds and he used them well. She paused. The call he made on your phone is on record with JAG. It's part of the deposition. She paused again, shorter this time. So are you. The corridor was very quiet. Coulter looked at Blake with an expression that had finished calculating and arrived at a place she recognized. Not surrender, not yet, but the place before surrender where a man is deciding whether the next move costs more than it buys. You have no physical documentation, he said. You have the testimony of a man who just came out of emergency surgery, impaired, medicated, potentially compromised. Cross has a documented blood alcohol level of 0 and a surgical anesthesia clearance signed by Dr. Voss at 2200 hours, Ward's voice said. She was in the doorway now. She had the recorder in one hand and the expression of a woman who has been building toward this specific moment for 3 months and has arrived at it fully prepared. Commander Ward, Coulter said. Admiral, Ward's voice was perfectly professional, perfectly steady. I've been looking forward to speaking with you, formally. She held up the recorder. I'd like to give you the opportunity to provide a statement. Now, before this deposition is filed and the window for voluntary cooperation closes. Coulter looked at the recorder. He looked at Blake. He looked at Hargrove. He looked at Taggart and Morse, who were both in their various ways communicating through their body language that they had reached the edge of whatever they were willing to do in a naval medical facility with staff in the corridor and cameras on the walls and a JAG commander with a running recorder. I want my counsel, Coulter said. Of course, Ward said. You can contact your counsel from downstairs. I'll have someone accompany you. She looked at Hargrove. Colonel, Hargrove stepped forward. Coulter left the corridor without another word. He walked with the same gravity, the same distinguished bearing, the same 40 years of composure. But something was different in the way he walked. Something had gone out of it, the particular quality of a man who believes the room is still his, still arranged in his favor, still operating by rules he controls. Taggart and Morse followed. Hargrove followed them. And the corridor was quiet. Blake stood for a moment without moving. She was aware of her own heartbeat even, and controlled the way it had been trained to be in situations far more physically dangerous than this one. She was aware of the recorder in Ward's hand still running. She was aware of the door behind her, and Cross behind the door, and Rex beside Cross. Then she turned and walked back into the room. Cross had heard all of it. His face when she came back in was the face of someone who has been lying still through a crisis they couldn't physically participate in, who has had to trust other people to hold a line they were used to holding themselves. It cost him something, she could see that. It always cost him. Done, he said. Done, she said. Coulter, he asked for his counsel. That means he's going to fight it. Yes, Ward said, stepping back in behind Blake. He's going to fight it. He has resources and connections, and he will use all of them. She sat down and looked at Cross with absolute directness. But the deposition is filed. It exists in a system he doesn't control and can't access. The 3 operators who died at Hollow Ridge, you're on record with the truth of what happened to them. The assets information is documented. None of that goes away. A beat. He can fight it. He won't win. Cross was quiet for a long moment. Rex shifted beside him. Cross's hand moved without conscious direction, finding the dog's head resting there. The 3 of them, Cross said. Santos, Yee, Kowalski. The names were quiet and precise and weighted with 14 months of carrying them. They'll be on the record. They're on the record, Ward said. Something released in Cross's face. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't the visible collapse of a long-held tension. It was smaller and more private than that, the subtle change of a person setting down something they'd been holding for so long. They'd stopped feeling the weight of it and feeling now for the first time what the absence of it was like. He closed his eyes. Rex pressed closer. Ward left at 1:15 a.m. to file the deposition formally with 2 JAG officers she trusted and a chain of custody documentation that left no procedural gap. Hargrove went with her, not because she needed the company, but because he had 30 years of operational experience and a detailed knowledge of which procedural gaps existed and how to close them. And Ward was too good at her job to refuse useful help. Strickland stayed outside the door. He had volunteered without being asked, and he'd done it in the quiet, determined way of someone who has been waiting for a chance to be useful in a specific way and is not going to waste it. Go home, Strickland, Blake had said. No, ma'am, he'd said. She'd looked at him for a moment. You've been sitting on that folder for 6 weeks. Yes, ma'am. That must have been hard. He'd been quiet for a second. It was the right thing to do, he'd said finally, waiting until there was someone to give it to who could actually use it. He'd paused. That's all it was. She'd looked at him the same way she'd looked at Cross in the trauma bay through the OR window for 4 hours and 11 minutes. Not the operational assessment, the other kind. Thank you, she'd said. He'd gone back to his post outside the door without another word. The room finally was quiet. Cross was awake. Not strongly, the surgery's weight was still on him, the slow insistence of a body demanding recovery time that hadn't been budgeted for. But his eyes were open and clear and present, in the particular way they were present when he was processing something at depth, turning it over in the silence of himself. Rex was asleep. It was the first time he had slept since the helicopter. Blake had watched him go under the gradual, reluctant surrender of an animal that has held vigil for too long and finally allowed itself to believe the vigil was no longer necessary. His breathing had evened out. His body had relaxed by degrees like a slowly loosening fist. He was still beside Cross. He would be beside Cross when he woke. Some things don't change based on circumstances. Blake was in the chair. She'd finally sat down at 12:48 a.m., and she had not gotten up since, and she had no plans to get up for a long time. You should sleep, Cross said. You should sleep, she said. I've been asleep for 6 hours. You were unconscious for 6 hours. That's different. He almost smiled. The frame of it was there, and something filled it in, tentative and real and tired and alive. 8 months, 11 days, he said again, not for the third time, for the first time in the tone of someone who has just now in the quiet of the aftermath allowed themselves to actually feel what those words mean. Somebody had to keep an eye on things, she said. You could have called. They were monitoring your phone. You could have, Liam. Her voice was quiet and final and entirely without edge. I was exactly where I needed to be. He looked at her. Whatever argument he'd been assembling in the tired machinery of his post-surgical brain, it didn't survive that sentence. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her when he'd first opened his eyes, with the particular relief of a man who has come back from a dark place and found that the person he was most afraid of not finding was there. Rex knew, he said. Rex always knows. In the trauma bay, he let you through. He recognized me. She paused. And he recognized that you needed help. She paused again, shorter. He chose. Cross looked at the sleeping dog. The Ghost K9 program called it loyalty architecture, he said. But that's not what it is. No, Blake agreed. It's trust. That's all it is. You build enough of it in enough dark places and it becomes something that doesn't need commands. He stopped. It just is. The monitor beeped steady and even. Rex's ear moved in his sleep. Blake looked at Cross and Cross looked at the ceiling, and neither of them said anything for a long time, because there was nothing that needed saying that hadn't already been said or demonstrated or carried for 8 months and 11 days through a janitor's closet, in a heating vent, and 200 nights of sleeping with one eye open and waiting for the moment she had always known would come. Rear Admiral Dennis Coulter was formally relieved of duty at 0600 the following morning. Ward had moved with a speed that Hargrove would later tell Strickland he had not believed a JAG inquiry was capable of. But Ward had been building toward this for 3 months, with the patience and precision of a woman who knew exactly what she was building and had refused to rush it until she had every piece she needed. When the last piece arrived, she had moved without hesitation and without mercy, and entirely within the law, which made it impossible to stop and impossible to appeal in the short term. Taggart and Morse were detained for questioning at 0615. By 0800, Meridian Group's contracts were frozen, pending a federal procurement investigation. By 0900, 3 other names that had appeared in the deposition as peripheral contacts. People who had received information they shouldn't have had were under formal inquiry. The building that had been constructed carefully over years, out of classified information and procurement contracts, and the particular corruption of people who had decided that their position gave them the right to profit from other people's lives and deaths, that building without its architect began to come apart. Slowly at first, then faster. The way structures come apart when the load-bearing element is removed. Cross was moved to a private room with a window at 0730. He sat up for the first time with help at 0900, and the first thing he said when he was upright was, "Where's Rex?" Rex was beside the bed. Rex had been beside the bed since they'd moved him. "Right here," Blake said. Cross put his hand on the dog's head. Rex looked up at him with the particular expression that had no human name, the expression that Lieutenant Reeves had said looked like praying and that Nora Blake had always thought looked more like recognition. The recognition of something so familiar and so necessary that seeing it again was its own kind of prayer. "Good boy," Cross said. Rex's tail moved once, deliberate and certain. Hargrove came by at 1000 with coffee, real coffee, not the facility dispensary version, and set it on the table without comment, which was the correct instinct. Ward came by at 1100 with a brief and said nothing about what was in it, which meant it was good, which Cross understood and didn't push. Strickland went home at noon, having stood his post for 11 hours. Before he left, he knocked on the doorframe and looked at Blake with the expression of someone who has just finished doing the right thing for the first time in a long time and has discovered that it feels different than they expected, heavier and lighter simultaneously, the particular weight of clean conscience. "Ma'am," he said. "Strickland," she said. That was all. It was enough. The investigation into Operation Hollow Ridge, the real investigation, the one with a full record and proper authority, and the testimony of a man who had carried the truth in his head through a burning field in a helicopter, and 4 hours and 11 minutes of emergency surgery, took 7 months. 7 months of depositions and documentation, and the careful, systematic dismantling of a structure that had been built to survive exactly this kind of scrutiny. Ward ran it with the same patience and precision she'd brought to the 3 months of preparation, and Hargrove supported it with the particular form of help that 30 years of institutional knowledge provides, and Cross testified 4 times each time with Rex in the room, which no regulation specifically prohibited, and which Ward had decided she was not going to address. Blake testified twice. Her testimony was the kind that makes lawyers uncomfortable, too precise, too detailed, too complete to challenge, without revealing the attempt to challenge it. She had spent 8 months preparing it without knowing for certain she'd ever get to give it. She gave it without notes and without hesitation and without once being caught in an inconsistency, because there were no inconsistencies. There was only what had happened exactly as it had happened, stored in the memory of a woman who had been trained to observe and retain and report with accuracy in situations far more hostile than a deposition room. Coulter's defense was extensive and expensive and ultimately insufficient. The 3 operators who had died at Hollow Ridge were given full posthumous recognition, their service records corrected to reflect the truth of what they had done and why they had died. Their families were notified. Their names were spoken in official settings with the accuracy they had always deserved. Santos, Yee, Kowalski, on record, where they would stay. Cross was cleared for limited duty 7 months after the surgery. The first thing he did on his first day back was walk out to the K9 training facility with Rex at his side and stand in the morning and breathe the air and let his dog run, which Rex did with the complete and unself-conscious joy of an animal released into space after too long in small rooms. Blake was there. She had been reinstated 4 months into the investigation quietly without ceremony, her ghost K9 clearances restored and her separation from service formally expunged from the record. She had not made a statement about it. She had simply returned to what she did because what she did was who she was, and 8 months in a janitor's closet had not changed that. They stood and watched Rex run. "What happens now?" Cross asked. Not anxiously, just asking. "Ward's recommending a full review of the Ghost K9 program's termination," Blake said. "She thinks it was shut down deliberately. Someone didn't want dogs that would only answer to one handler too hard to control." "She's right," Cross said. "I know. And the program, she's recommending reinstatement." A pause. "With new protocols, new oversight." Cross watched Rex circle back toward them, full speed, ears flat, the particular focused joy of a working dog in its element. He crouched, caught Rex as he arrived, and Rex pushed into him with his whole body, not gently, not carefully, with the full, unsubtle force of a Belgian Malinois who has been waiting to do exactly this for 7 months and does not see any reason to moderate the expression of it. Cross laughed, rough and real and entirely alive. Blake watched him, and the thing she'd been holding for 14 months, not the mission, not the evidence, not the strategy, but the specific human thing, the thing that lived underneath all the operational structure in the part of her that had stood in a janitor's closet on the 3rd floor and told herself every morning that it would be worth it, that he would make it, that she would be there when he did that thing settled into something she didn't have a military word for. Something quieter and more permanent than any operation she had ever run. Rex looked at her. She crouched beside them. Rex put his head in her hands. She pressed her forehead against his. "Good boy," she said, for the second time in 7 months. In the same voice, with the same weight. "You did so good." Rex's tail moved. Cross beside her said nothing. He didn't need to. Some partnerships are built in training facilities under supervision according to documented protocol. And some are built in burning fields and helicopter bays and trauma rooms and janitor's closets on third floors at 3 in the morning when no one is watching and nothing is guaranteed. And the only thing holding the whole thing together is a decision made once remade every day to not let go, to not stop, to stay. Rex had held a trauma bay for 20 minutes and refused to move from a table and carried his handler out of a burning field and waited with the infinite patience of something that does not know how to do anything except be completely and irrevocably present. Nora Blake had spent 8 months and 11 days in a building full of people who didn't know her name, waiting for a moment she couldn't be certain would come because the alternative was to leave, and she had never once in her entire life considered leaving a person behind. Liam Cross had carried a name in his head through fire and surgery, and 14 months of being watched and followed because 3 people deserved to have the truth of what happened to them spoken out loud, and he was the only one left who could speak it. None of them had been ordered to do what they did. None of them had done it for rank or recognition or record. They had done it because of a thing that doesn't fit in official documentation, that can't be trained into a person or a dog by protocol, that exists only in the particular dark places where trust is built the hard way, and loyalty is not a policy, but a choice made over and over in silence without guarantee for no reason, except that it is the only kind of person you know how to be. That thing has a name. It's the oldest name there is, and it holds when everything else breaks. It always holds.